Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 35th election in Canadian history happened on the 25th of October, 1993. In between this time, incumbent Prime Minister Kim Campbell was doing horrible. Kim Campbell? I watched the last video. I know Brian Mulroney this one. You cannot fool me. Yeah, Brian Mulroney did win the last election, but he was doing quite horrible in this second term. In fact, so horrible that he resigned and Kim Campbell stuck up. It's really hard not to notice the Meech Lake Accord, which was a horrible, horrible event for the Progressive Conservatives. Brian Mulroney also introduced the goods and service tax. Yeah, that was him. After having enough of the former Prime Minister John Turner as the leader of the Liberal Party, a leadership convention was held for the Liberals, in which they nominated Jean Chrétien. Because of this, Kim Campbell launched a very, very controversial ad making fun of Chrétien for his inability to speak out of both sides of a mouth due to his paralyzation, when he was 6 years old?
Is a Prime Minister? Does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a Prime Minister?
When Chrétien saw the ad, he was very understandably, to say the least, mad, and he responded with this in an interview.
Conservative Party reach a new low. They try to make fun of the way I look. God gave me a physical defect. And I've accepted that since I'm a kid. It's true that I speak on one side of my mouth. I'm not a Tory, I don't speak on both sides of my mouth.
This, alongside the fact that the Conservative stronghold of seats in the western side of Canada was being gobbled up by Preston Manning's Reform Party, the Conservatives were on track for one of the worst election defeats in Canadian history. Also, it's not like they're going to get any seats out of Quebec, because the horrors of the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accords led to the creation of the Bloc Québécois Party, which is now led by Lucien Bouchard, which's goal is to solely become an independent nation for Quebec separatists, which obviously no one likes unless you live in Quebec, which I guess then is fair, but still, it's not really popular. And shortly after the last election, the NDP leader, Ed Broadbent, decided, I'm going to take a back seat, and decided that he was going to pass on his crown of NDP leader to the only, and to this date, only candidate in Canadian history to run from a territory, Audrey McLaughlin, who is running from the seat of Yukon. Congratulations to Yukon. Round of applause. With that said, we should get into the results of this election. There were 295 seats in the House of Commons and 148 needed for a majority. When 70.9% turned out to vote, it would give the winner 5,647,952 votes, which is 41.24% of the popular vote. And that would also give him 177 seats for a majority. That would be Jean Chrétien, who would finally become the Prime Minister after running against John Turner in the 1984 Leadership Convention. Lucien Bouchard in the Bloc Québécois Party got second with a total of 54 votes, making it the first time that either the Liberals or the Progressive Conservatives or Conservative Party the First was not the official leader of the opposition. It was also the first time that a party dedicated to separatism was the opposition in Canada. The third place spot went to the Reform Party with 52 seats. The NDP got last, falling down to 9 from previously 54. And there's Kim Campbell with 2 seats, the worst defeat for any progressive conservative party and for any party leader in Canadian history. The Progressive Conservative Party's demise was evident by this point, to say the least, and the Progressive Conservatives would never have a single prime minister in office again. And it was also the last election that took place 5 years after the previous one, like the Constitution allows it to be. And I'll see you guys for the election of 1997. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 36th election in Canadian history happened on the 2nd of June 1997, where the incumbent Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was dipping in popularity while the Conservatives were actually going up in the polls. However, the gap between Jean Chrétien and the Conservatives in the polls was so big, if Jean Chrétien did not win, it would seem like, something bad happened to the country. He's been leader since the 23rd of June 1990 and is running in St. Maurice. The Reform Party from the last election has actually gone up in popularity as well. Their leader, Preston Manning, who's been the leader since the 1st of November 1987 and has got his leader seat in Calgary Southwest, is also much more popular than he was 4 years ago. The Bloc Québécois is also playing really, really high in the polls, with Gilles Duceppe as its leader since the 15th of March 1997, which was, of course, that year after the previous Bloc Québécois leader had resigned. The New Democratic Party elected a new leader as well, with Alexa McDonough, who's been the leader since the 14th of October 1995, who's got their leader seat in Halifax. And of course, the best for last, the Progressive Conservative leader, Jean Charest, who's been the leader since the 29th of April 1995 and is running in Sherbrooke. A big reason for many of Jean Chrétien's votes is because the economy was doing very, very well, taxes were going down, and actually in 1997, Canada was ranked as the best country to live in. Why wouldn't you want to vote for the guy who's making that happen? And many people in the East actually did vote for Chrétien because the Reform Party was really just a Western-based party. The NDP was seen as the Liberals' younger brother at that time. The Bloc Québécois was, strictly Québécois. The Conservative Party had fallen off, so really the only major party was the Liberal Party, and they were doing quite well at running the country. Although many people plan to cast their vote aside from Chrétien because of the controversial election being called right away after Manitoba's recovery from the Red River flood earlier in the year. Reg Alcock and several others inside the Liberal Party had opposed the timing of the vote, and the poor results prompted Paul Martin's supporters, which was one of Jean Chrétien's MP, to organize against Chrétien. And with that being said, it's time to jump right into this election, where there were 301 seats in the House of Commons. 151 seats were needed for a majority in the House of Commons. The winner of this election would win 155 seats, 4,994,277 votes, which is 38.46% of the popular vote. That would be Jean Chrétien, with the Reform Party coming in second, the Bloc Québécois in third, McDonough's new NDP in fourth, and the Progressive Conservatives in fifth. And I'll see you guys for the election of 2000. Dazod 500 presents Canadian elections of history. The 37th election in Canadian history happened on the 27th of November 2000. The incumbent prime ministership with Jean Chrétien's Liberal Party isn't the most unpopular and actually is going quite well. The Reform Party is dead. It is now called the Alliance Party, which is led by Stockwell Day since the 24th of June 2000. The Bloc Québécois is going to be sticking with Gilles Duceppe from 1997. I think the last leader was removed. Again, it's been quite a while since I did one of these. The NDP leader, Alexa McDonough, was the same as the last one. And the Progressive Conservatives, who are in their worst time in their history, have decided to put their most unpopular prime minister back in. Joe Clark is now the leader of the Progressive Conservatives again. Don't know how that happened. Historians tend to agree that the placement of this election was actually very smart by Jean Chrétien. In fact, there were many reasons as to why. It was some of these reasons that these historians argue is to squash the leadership ambition of Paul Martin to become the leader of the Liberal Party, and to stem a possible rise of support to the newly founded Canadian Alliance Party, and to capitalize on the nostalgia created by the recent death of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. At the time of the election, the Canadian economy was strong, and there were few immediate negative issues, as the opposition parties were not prepared for the campaign. But most of the public didn't actually care too much for this election, believing that it would be practically the same as the 1997 one. And the disinterest amongst Canadians was heavily present at the voting box that day, with only 64.1% of Canadians actually voting in this election. The first place candidate got a total of 172 seats, with a popular vote of 5,252,031 votes, to be very, very specific. And they won about 40.85% of the popular vote, and that would be incumbent Jean Chrétien. I think it's very important to note that this was the last election, as of when I'm recording this, that a party has successfully defended their parliamentary majority. And I'll see you guys for the election of 2004. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 38th election in Canadian history happened on the 28th of June 2004. The Liberal Party leader actually changed since the last one. It was Jean Chrétien up until November of 2003, when he resigned due to fears that he'd be overtaken by, of course, his successor and at the time Finance Minister Paul Martin, who is now, of course, the Liberal leader. His main opposition will be the Conservative Party, who had a recent election for leadership, and they elected Stephen Harper to be their leader going into this election. The Bloc Québécois is going to stick with Gilles Duceppe. He's the only leader of any of the parties, the major parties at least, that was elected in the last millennium. And the New Democratic Party is sticking with the now famous Jack Layton, and he has been the leader since January of 2003. He's actually running from Toronto Danforth, and I live pretty close to there. So, while not getting any seats, I think it's fair to bring up the Green Party here, whose leader was Jim Harris, and they actually managed to field a candidate in all 308 seats in the House of Commons and won twice as many votes as they did in the previous election, which sounds nice but it doesn't really, when you realize that they got 4.3% of the vote. So The Liberals were on track to win a fourth huge majority in the House of Commons, but just a couple months later, they were polling at 10% nationally, and that's because of the sponsorship scandal, which actually was meant to be a counteractive kind of thing to the Parti Québécois, which wanted to, of course, promote Quebec independence. This program ran from 1996 until 2004, which is, of course, the election recovering, when broad corruption was discovered in its operations and it was discontinued. Illicit and even illegal activities within the administration of the program were revealed, involving misuse and misdirection of public funds intended for government advertising in Quebec. This actually hurt more in Ontario and Quebec, but eventually Paul Martin would gain support back in those areas, but gaining magic votes in the West, yeah, it was totally not happening for Paul Martin. But before you think the Conservatives won in a landslide, they were the only major party in Canada to support the Iraq War. And that is interesting to note because unlike in America where it seems like everyone loved the war, in Canada we were a little bit more skeptical with the invasion of Iraq. So yeah, the Conservatives supported it and the rest of the major party candidates didn't really support it either. That said, the Conservatives were the slight favorites going into the election, but did that hold up? Well, the winner of this election got 135 seats, which is less than what Jean Chrétien won in 2000. They won 4,982,220 votes, which amounted to 36.73% of the popular vote. And no, it did not amount up because that was Paul Martin, who broke the trend of being dumped in right before the election and losing. He won this election against Stephen Harper, but it was rather close, at least with the votes wise. With the seats, there was a 36-seat difference, which I guess isn't too much. Having not won a majority of the seats in the election, Paul Martin was open to having a supply and confidence deal with Jack Layton and the NDP. And going into the election night, there was definitely going to be one of those agreements, but the Conservatives pulled an upset and won one of the seats in British Columbia, meaning that if you combine the Liberals and the NDP seat total, it would amount to one less than it was needed for a majority, and the one independent candidate refused to join the deal. So for 2 years, the election, the Canadian government was basically a dud. This election also had the lowest amount of voter turnout up to that point, with only 60.9%. And I'll see you guys for the election of 2006. The Zod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 39th election in Canadian history happened on the 23rd of January 2006, where the incumbent Prime Minister Paul Martin wasn't so popular. New details of the sponsorship scandal, also known as ad scam, which is where Jean Chrétien tried to remove public funding from the Department of Public Works and the government services to private advertising agencies to promote Canada and the federal government at the cultural, community, and sports events in Quebec was released. And, in fact, on the 28th of November 2005, Paul Martin's government was defeated on a motion of no confidence. But a day later, Martin met with the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, triggering an unusual winter election. Despite this election being one that was just called out of the middle of nowhere, the campaigning for this election was 8 weeks long and was the longest in over 2 decades. Harper started off the first month of the campaign with a policy per day strategy, which included a GST reduction and a child care allowance. The Liberals opted to hold any major announcements until after the Christmas holidays. As a result, Harper dominated media coverage for the first weeks of the campaign and was able to define his platform and insulate it from expected Liberal attacks. On the 27th of December 2005, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police announced that it was investigating allegations that the Liberal Finance Minister, Ralph Goodale's office, had engaged in insider trading before making an important announcement on the taxation of income trusts. The RCMP indicated that they had no evidence of wrongdoing or criminal activity from any party associated with the investigation, including Goodale. However, the story dominated news coverage for the following week and prevented the Liberals from making their key policy announcements, allowing the Conservatives to refocus their previous attacks about corruption within the Liberal Party. The Conservatives soon found themselves leading in the polls, and by early January, they made a breakthrough in Quebec, pushing the Liberals to second place. Despite Paul Martin making Canada the third country in the world to officially legalize same-sex marriage, his legalization of that was not at the top of many voters' minds. In fact, it was, well, of course, the sponsorship scandal. But there were several issues in this election too, notably the fiscal imbalance, the gun registry, abortion, and Quebec sovereigntism. Ipsos had actually carried out an exit poll just before the election, and there was actually some very interesting results here. The Conservatives were winning over the moderates, and they had both the men and the women. Women tend to vote to the left, and men do tend to vote to the right. So the Conservatives having such a wide, maybe not that wide, but a win in women is actually surprising. For marital status, only the single people supported Paul Martin, and that was only by 1%. Catholics and Protestants were the only religious identity group to have said that they were going to vote for Stephen Harper. But all of the religious service attendants, in wide margins, voted for Stephen Harper. He also won over everyone in the age and age by gender. And for the sexual orientation, Paul Martin was expectedly winning in the LGBTQ. And a quick little note before we actually get into the results. For the second consecutive time, the Green Party had nominated a single candidate in every single one of the 308 ridings in the country. And now, with 64.7% of eligible Canadians voting in this election, which is a 3.8% increase from the last election, the winner of this election would receive a minority government with 124 seats. With 5,374,000 votes, that equates to 36.27% of the popular vote. And despite his claims of wanting to get a majority government, it was Stephen Harper to get the minority. A lot of people were expecting this, because it looked very mathematically unlikely that Stephen Harper could even possibly win a majority government. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 40th election in Canadian history took place on the 14th of October in 2008. This was only 2 years after the previous election, so what was the reasoning for this election being scheduled so close? Well, this was because the Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who didn't do much in those first 2 years, called the election due to his belief that there was a lack of cooperation between the minority government. Conservatives and the opposition party, which the former had to rely on to pass legislation, hence Harper argued that the Parliament had reached the end of its productiveness. While Harper's government may not have done anything truly big, aside from the 2007 Act to amend the Canadian Elections Act, which received royal assent on the 3rd of May of that year, This bill requires each general election to take place on the third Monday in October in the fourth calendar year after the previous election. Okay, but other than that, Harper didn't do much. But what did happen during Harper's prime ministership was the Great Recession. It already started in December of the previous year in the United States, but didn't actually cross the border illegally until September. The election campaign officially began on the 7th of September at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with the Liberal leader, Stephanie Dion, coming right at the gates to attack the Conservatives' record, presenting the Liberal plan and rejecting the accusation by Harper that the Liberal Party is a risky choice. NDP leader Jack Layton took a much more forceful approach than in previous elections, in which the NDP has just tried to maintain a high number of seats in Parliament to influence the government. Jack Layton, their leader, has made it clear that he will campaign for the position of Prime Minister itself this time, not just a Member of Parliament. The Bloc Québécois party was not doing so well, and it wasn't as popular as it was in previous elections. However, once the leader of that party, Gilles Duceppe, attacked Stephen Harper of being close with the George W. Bush presidency, which in Canada was not popular, most Canadians did not like that guy, he started to get a lot more popular at the expense of Stephen Harper. The new Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, made numerous gaffes throughout the election campaign. Like this one, on October 12th, she recommended that in close ridings, supporters of the Green Party should consider voting for the NDP or the Liberal Party to defeat the Conservatives. But on the same day, she said, "I do not support strategic voting, and I have not advised voters to choose any candidate other than the Green one." In addition, during the final days of the campaign, the Liberals attempted to attract strategic NDP and Green voters to stop the Conservatives, and the Conservatives attempted to attract Bloc votes to stop the Liberals. And with over 58.8% of turnout, which was 6% less than in the last election, the winner of this election got 143 seats, which is not enough for a majority. 155 would have been needed. This candidate got 5.2 million votes and 37.6% of the popular vote. His name? Well, that was Stephen Harper, who won another term in office. However, something tells me that that's not going to last for long. Stephanie Dion, who only received 77 seats, which was 18 less than what Paul Martin got in 2006, was the first Liberal leader since Edward Blake back in the 1880s to have never at one point served as Prime Minister. Following the results of this election, the Liberals and NDPs tried to form a coalition government and topple the Conservatives from power, but just based off my last sentence, you would know that they were unsuccessful in doing so. And I'll see you guys for the election of 2011.